Hey, what's up, everybody? You're listening to another episode of Preacher Boys. On today's episode, I'm sitting down with Tim Morris from Texas. Tim has a pretty interesting story. Although he didn't personally experience abuse of any kind, thank goodness, he was involved with 3 different churches, all very close to each other, that all had issues with sexual assault of children, rape, molestation, and he looks at the cause and effect of all of these ministries, where the people came from, all the commonalities that they shared. And so if you're someone that's been listening that says, well, hey, independent Baptist churches are independent, how can you blame each other for the actions of random anomalies? This episode really shows that it's not an anomaly. These are people sharing very similar worldviews, coming from the same colleges, and doing the same kind of things. And so I think this is a really good episode for you guys to listen to. Tim is super helpful, shares a ton of information, and there are so many names that you can look up that he refers to. There is documented proof of these cases. So please enjoy the episode. As always, I want to issue a quick trigger warning. We are talking about rape, child molestation, abuse, and so these are topics that are very sensitive. So if it's not something you're ready to listen to right now, that's okay. Just add it to your queue. Come back to it later when it's good for you to do so. All right, guys, here's the episode. All right, Tim, thank you so much for joining me. Can you share a little bit about what your introduction to the IFB movement was?
Yes, I was born into it back in '86, and the church that we went to back then was a Hiles Graduates Church, and from there, my dad got out of church for a while, and then my mom kept us going to church. We went on the bus to another church in the area that was also a Hiles affiliated church, and my dad got back into church again, and when he did, he took a lot of what Hiles had in his printed books, and he brought that into his church where he was going to pastor. And my dad had some issues and stuff. My parents ended up divorcing for about a year's time, and during that year time, I went back to the church that we had went to back in the '80s, which is the Hiles Anderson Graduate Church, and I was there for a while. I restarted a deaf ministry that my mother had originally started back in the '80s, but it had kind of died out by then. And life was good. I never questioned anything. Um, I when my dad was pastor, I actually would judge his church because they weren't as Hilesy as the church that I had wished I could have gone to at the time. So I was judgmental of my dad's ways of pastoring.
So you almost viewed yourself as like the most spiritual that you could get.
Well, kind of on the inside more so. I just saw that my dad's my dad would use Hiles's manual for like his soul winning and his church setup that he had, but he actually did not like Hiles for his standards as far as like dress and stuff. So
Because he was too strict or he was too loose?
According to my dad, Hiles was definitely too strict.
Okay.
But in my head, I always looked at that church across town as being like the gold standard,
Right.
and my church as being like just the slums. So
Right. So at the peak of your involvement with the IFB, so you attended for how long? How long were you involved?
I was born into it, so from '86 to officially about almost 2 years ago. And I'm 33 now, about 31 years.
Okay. So I guess what time of your life would you say you were at the peak of your involvement and buy into it? And how would you have described it? If someone at that time would have said, hey, describe the IFB to me, what would you have said?
Oh, I would say that we're King James only. We're soul winning. Um, we had high standards, and ladies wouldn't wear pants, and guys didn't go to church unless they wore a suit coat. Basically, I would just tell everyone the high standards that we had that made us so different from everyone else. And I would say the peak moment was probably when I was 17 to 26.
Right. And so obviously you're on this podcast, you're no longer a part of it. So what was it that was the first thing that you noticed where you're like, this isn't right, or this something feels off here? What was it that kind of started making you question what you were thinking and the mindset that you did have?
The original thing that happened, and this kind of goes into a little story. I was working for Lifeway Christian bookstores, and my job was to sell Bibles. And so one day I saw this family come in, and they were looking for a Bible, and I was like, "Well, good, I have the right one just for you." And so I took them to the Bible section and I said, "Right here's the King James, and that's the one I prefer." And they said, "Well, we really want to try to find one that doesn't have all of these thines and thous in it." I said, "Well, the ones that are like that, they're not real Bibles." And I
Mm,
said, "The Bible that you really want is the King James." I said, "It has all of these and thines and thous in it, but you're gonna have a real accurate Bible that's, the, just like the original manuscripts, really close to it." I said, "This is the one that is the right one for the English speaking people."
right.
And they're like, and and I knew a little bit about the arguments that I was taught to use. Like the other versions might have 16 verses totally missing out of their Bibles total, and that the story of they had a little there's a little wording that was at the very end that was a little off. That kind of made it out to be, I forgot the exact wording, but and so I knew all the arguments to use, and I convinced them that the King James was the way to go. And so I gave them a tract from my church, and they came. And after about, well, when they came to my church, the whole family got saved and baptized, and they were really active in church. And the mother of that family came to me and said, "Hey, Tim, my best friend at work, she's a Mormon. Can you tell me what they believe?" I said, "Well, I don't know what they believe, but I know they're wrong." She said, "Well, I need some more concrete information so I can go on." I said, "Okay." So I went home and I studied about the Mormons for a while, and I um I had, I guess, got a burden to reach out to Mormons, and so
Mm,
when I did that, I went back to church and I said, "Don't worry, I got you some CDs and some books," and I said, "This really messed up, so whatever you do, just wait till you can see the material that I have for you." And when that went, and then I wanted to meet some local ex-Mormons in the area, and I found a group that was ex-Mormons and now they're Christians. And I went to that group, and they were talking about their times in Mormonism. And when they did, something in my head just clicked. Like, this sounds just like the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church. And I was like, this sounds just like the church I was raised in. I said,
in what
hey,
regard, as far as
the
what belief pattern?
the mind control that they put over people. Um, and they have really high expectations for their members, and they keep them active in the church where they can't leave the church. And so yeah, I saw that they had some similarities as far as the mind control, and I guess standards in a different kind of way, but definitely kept their folks active to where they wouldn't, I guess, wouldn't have time to really question what's going on.
Right. Interesting. And so what did you do with this information? Was it something that you just kind of kept researching for a couple of years on your own? Was it something you instantly
Well,
brought to family or to leadership, or what was that process for you?
I put it on the back shelf, and I still stayed faithful. I still stayed, and so, but before that actually, like, actually shortly after that happened, I had met some missionaries in my area and stuff, and I started working with them. Um, but the pastor had of my church at the time, he had he was arrested for a rape charge in West Virginia. And the way the story goes is that he had told the church he was going to a conference, but he gets arrested for rape and ends up killing himself in jail. And
Uh,
through that, um, I saw a lot of cover ups going on in the church
right.
that all the assistant pastors knew about, but But even through all that, I knew that they wouldn't stay very long in that church, and so I went ahead and said, you know what, I kind of had the same kind of mentality that the Mormons might have, is that men can be wrong, but the church is still true. The church is still right.
Right.
That's the mindset I had. And so after he had done that, I had decided I was going to stay in the church and give this new pastor a shot, and I did for 2 years.
Huh. So this was all recent. So you mentioned like they were cover up. So this was the pastor of the church you were attending, correct?
Right. Yeah, I went to Open Door Baptist Church in Mesquite, and
In Michigan?
Texas.
Oh, in Texas.
Right.
Okay. There's another Open Door Baptist church.
Yeah, there is one in Michigan. That's right.
Okay.
So yeah, I went there and I stayed through those 2 years, and then after 2 years, I left that church, and the pastor of my former church from probably when I was like 18, 19 years old, that pastor had kind of got fed up with some of the IB stuff that's going on, and he kind of distanced himself from that movement in a way. He still saved King James and stuff, but he got fed up with like Bob Gray and Jack Hyles and stuff. So he told me, he said, the pastor of that church does not pay you a penny. And what I would do, since you're going to leave your church, is I would write on toilet paper, I'm leaving the church, and put it under his door. I was like, well, I can't put it on toilet paper and do it. So I wrote a 1-page letter to my pastor and put it under his door. And while I was doing it, I was so sick to my stomach, I thought I was going to throw up, because I was so afraid to leave the church, because if I did, I knew that there were going to be some repercussions of that. And I left and went to a Southern Methodist church for about a year and a half. And when I left the church, about 6 months later, I had a really bad car accident. And I was in the hospital for about a month. And the pastor who came to be pastor for those 2 years, I had decided I was going to stay. He had told me that the reason why I was in this car accident was because I left the church. And I had a broken leg, a fractured pelvis, and blood transfusion and everything else. But he said the reason why I was in the hospital, and the reason why I had the accident was because I had left this church, and that's the reason why I had it.
Wow. So circling back, just for context, like I can kind of in my mind, just from speaking with other people and from researching, when you say there were cover-ups or that there was this manipulation over the situation, you know, I can kind of picture what that is. But for somebody who's listening who may be saying, well, how did they cover up stuff? What did you notice happening? Was it just they just brushed under the rug and didn't talk about it? Was there no one knew what was going on, but only a few people knew? What did the cover up look like as far as the church went?
Well, that one cover-up was like this. So I came to church in 2008, and the pastor, I really liked the pastor a lot. And I mean, he was a great pastor. When he was there, I really didn't have any issues with him. But when he had hung himself in jail, the news came out and said that he had a rape charge in San Antonio, Texas from 2007. And I was like, wait a minute. I was like, if he had a rape charge back in 2007, what did the church know at that time? Well, speaking to other members in the church, they said, well, they were told that he had that he was in the hospital with kidney stones during that time.
Wow.
And so the associate pastors came back and said, pray for your pastor. He's in the hospital. He has kidney stones. And another thing was the pastor had embezzled almost $1 million from the church. And he had all these other accounts that he had set up, and he told his secretary, transfer this much money to this account. She just never questioned him. But she did write down, every time he told to transfer money, she did write down that he asked her to transfer money. And through all the asking that he did, it totaled up to a really huge sum of money. But just those kinds of corrupts that, that a normal person would have maybe questioned, why would you want to transfer, let's say, $20,000 from church account to this account. What's the purpose
Right.
for it? There was no questioning behind it because he's the man of God, and you just do what he says.
Wow, that's crazy. Um, wow, yeah. So, so obviously, this is when you start really noticing there's an issue. So, then when you chose to leave, what was the process? So he visited you in the hospital about this is 6 months after
Yes.
leaving. Did you believe him? Did you have this thought of like, maybe I did make a big mistake leaving, or did it kind of harden that position of, I did the right thing getting out of here? That's crazy. What was kind of your thought process when he said that to you?
It was the mindset that he's crazy, and there's a good reason why I'm not going to this church anymore.
Right, right.
And yeah, he he was just, during the 2 years he was there, he was a very much like a drill sergeant. He had come from Jim Vineyard's church in Oklahoma City at Winter Hill. And as soon as he came into the church, he was just a drill sergeant the whole entire time. He said that the girls' skirts were too short. They were already to the knee. They were still too short. So, and he would preach against denim skirts on women and men having facial hair. And and I remember going to church one day. He said, "You cannot live the spirit-filled Christian life if you're a woman wearing a denim skirt, or if you're a man and you have facial hair." He said,
Wow.
if you do either one of those things, you cannot live the spirit-filled Christian life. And I will never forget that comment he had made in his preaching.
What was the church you said? It cut out a little bit when you said the church you had come from. Where was it?
Open Door Baptist Church in Mesquite,
Um,
Texas.
and then this pastor had transferred from a different church.
He came from Jim Vineyard's church at Winter Hills Baptist Church in Oklahoma City. Which now that church is no longer named Winter Hills. Now they're under a whole new name because there was some other scandals in the church. They had to change their church name and location.
Really? Do you know what the new church name is? By any chance, or no?
Yes, the church was Higher Plain. Yeah, it's Higher Plain Baptist Church now. And Tom Vineyard, who is Jim Vineyard's son, he's the pastor of the church.
Oh, I see here. Oh, it's so weird. So I Googled him, and then the first that pops up, I'm like, oh, he's connected with an organization that I'm familiar with, all the way in California. Um, it's amazing when you start Googling a church name and you're like, oh, we're all more connected than we think.
Right.
Sorry, I don't want to get too distracted. I always like to Google or write down when someone mentions the name. So what was the, um, I don't know what you'd call it, recovery process, mindset shift leaving? Because obviously when you're spending over 30 years believing very staunchly that we're right, everyone's wrong, I am the bastion of Christian holiness, when you have this very strict religious background and then you step out away from that, there is a process of kind of mental spiritual recovery. What did that look like for you? What was helpful for you along that kind of journey?
Well, at that time, I had not started that because when I got out of the hospital, um, I was going to my Southern Baptist church for maybe another 4 or 5 months, and then I was kind of in my head. I was guilted into going back to another IFB church, so I
Oh,
went
okay.
back
Wow. And
for
what
2
church was
years.
that?
That church was Parkside Baptist Church in Mesquite, and
Okay.
yeah, they had some more scandals of their own, which I had left after their other scandal they had. Um, when I was there for 2 years, I remember the first year I was there with the rules and the mandates from the pastor. I mean, I went soul winning, and when they had a fall program, I was the assistant of the team leader and stuff, and I was in charge of doing additional soul winnings on top of the Saturdays or Thursday soul winning. And I saw some things that I didn't like during that program. I saw a teenage boy in a church. He was trying to gather a group of 15 to 20 kids around him when he was trying to share the gospel, and he told the kids, basically he said, Jesus died for your sin. If you believe in Jesus and say this prayer, you'll be saved. And all 15, 20 kids bowed their head, supposedly, and received Christ. And I left, and I was like, he didn't talk to any of these kids one-on-one. He never really made sure all the kids really understood what they were doing. And now he's going to go to church. He's going to say, I have 15 saved. And then all he has to do is just have the kids' names, and then boom, he's getting awards in the church for leading so many people to Christ and all this stuff. Right. But during that program, I stayed with it, and I did my best to have as many salvations as I could and visitors and stuff. And I actually won the Sunday school contest in my church for having the most points in Sunday school. And I was in the pastor's class too. And the second year, though, every time I went to church, I would literally show up right on time and leave during the invitation. And at this time, I was working in deaf ministry, and I was interpreting. So as soon as my interpreting was over, I left, and I just got out of that church as fast as I could, because I didn't want to hear the pastor. I didn't want to hear. I didn't really want to talk to anyone at all. I was just getting really fed up with it. But I still felt like I really couldn't leave, because the pastor was depending on me to interpret. And if I wasn't there to interpret, then they were going to be short interpreters. And so I felt like there was an obligation I had to that church, so I just couldn't leave. But anyhow, I had left after they had a sexual assault scandal in their church. I had left. And
was that against the pastoral staff, or was that a member? What did that case look like?
Yeah, so this was a Sunday school teacher in the church. She was a college student. And what happened was, in April of 2018, I was sitting down at my desk, and my neighbor had posted on Facebook that there was a Sunday school teacher arrested for continuous sexual assault of a child. And I looked at it, I was like, oh my goodness. I said, he goes to my church. So I was like, what's going on here? So then they said the abuse started most likely they gave a month. It was like from March to October of that year, of the year before that. And my mind went back to a time frame, and there's things that have happened. He was engaged to this man who was accused was engaged to get married. Well, in October, when supposedly the sexual assault ended, him and his fiance weren't sitting together in church anymore. And they had announced that the wedding was being postponed.
Right.
And I said, well, maybe there was an issue. This is my thing at the time. Maybe there's an issue. It's none of my business. People have problems, and maybe they don't have money or something. And so that was my thing at the time. But then I was like, wait a minute. So, and then in March of that year, I quit seeing him at church. And I was like, where is he at? Why is he at church anymore? Well, apparently the police got involved in March. When the police got involved, he quit coming to church. And so my mindset was that maybe he just I was assuming the church probably asked him to not come back because the police were getting involved, right, and they didn't want him in church because of that reason. So I told myself I was going to go hear the pastor out. It was like on a Sunday night. I was going to go hear him out, and when he was trying to explain it, he never named the name of the person. But he did say if there's any more victims to let them come forward. And that they need to come forward because there could be more victims, because he was obviously very active, involved with children in their ministries. Right. And that's all he said. He really didn't say anything else, and I wasn't satisfied with his reasoning. And so my sister was there at that service. She she's not really active in church right now. And she was there for that service, and I told her, I said, I'm not coming back anymore. I'm done. Because I saw this time frame just didn't match up. Well, when I left, about a month later, the associate pastor called me, and it was a number I didn't recognize. Had I recognized the number, I would have answered it. So the associate pastor called me and said, Tim, he said, what's going on? We missed you at church. I said, yeah. I said, I'm just having some problems with some things that I thought the church knew about, and they didn't come forward. He said, what's that? So I told him exactly what I told you. And he said, well, brother, he said, I just found out whenever you found out. I didn't know anything. I said, okay, but somebody knew something. I said, it only makes sense that someone knew something. He said, well, Tim, the church hired a private investigator to look into the matter.
Okay.
I said, and whose money did they use for that? He said, well, they used the church's money. I said, okay, wait a minute. I said, the money that we gave with our tithes and offerings, the church used that money to hire a private investigator to look into a sexual assault, but you didn't go to the police? He said, that's what I was told by the pastor. And I was like, so that told me right there, someone knew something because they had hired supposedly a private investigator to look into it. And that's when I said, I'm not interested in continuing this conversation. And it's basically over now.
Yeah, that is interesting, because I could see that being a decent use of funds after going to the police and saying, hey, let's bring someone in to just see if there's anything else going on.
Right.
That's a different question. But to do that in lieu of police is kind of sketchy.
The police didn't get involved until supposedly after the private investigator. But I just didn't like that. They didn't come to the church and ask us for our permission to move funds that we paid to the church.
Right.
Look into this, because I think there'd be an issue that they should have come to us about,
and that they wouldn't share the results of the investigation if you're the funds of the congregation.
Right. And the one thing I realized in the IFB, when there is a situation like that, the men, the preachers, they tend to supposedly not know what to do in that situation. There's not really a good training for people as far as like if you suspect any kind of abuse of a child, you have 48 hours to report it. And they either they literally don't know about that law, or they just don't care about it. But I mean, this church was known for after the fact, I realized that moving sexual predators around in their churches, and so they would relocate one to this church or vice versa. Another thing that had happened that was interesting was I had watched them while I was still going there before this man did his thing. I didn't go to the missions conference. I watched it on live services, and there was a missionary there that I recognized from my former church at Open Door, and he was presenting his work, and I was like, wow. I said, that's interesting. Well, after this other guy who was sexually molesting kids, after his news came out, something told me, look for sexual predators, like registered sex offenders in your area. Look them up and just see what you see. And so I did. And when I did that, I recognized that man's face was a missionary at the missions conference. And I also mentioned
his name by any chance?
I said, why? His name is Ochando, Manuel Ochando. He was a missionary to the prison ministry of all places. And so as far as I know, he's really just local in this area. But anyway, when I saw his name and I saw that he was a moderate risk and that he was a lifetime registered sex offender, I even told the associate pastor about that. He said, Brother Tim, he said, we realized he had problems probably 2 months before he actually came to our church, because he was preaching, he was referring to verses that were in the NIV during college chapel. And we realized that, and so that's why we didn't take him on for support. I said, that's not the issue. The issue is you had a man who was a registered sex offender coming to your church, sitting behind your pulpit, and no one thought to look on the local registered sex offenders list to make sure his name was not on there.
So they were more upset about his position on Bible translations than they were about the child molestation charges.
Yeah, definitely, yes.
Yeah,
child molesting problems you can overlook, but that version problem you just cannot overlook which version of the Bible.
Right. No, so this is crazy. So like I've been just searching, and some of the names that you mentioned I'm familiar with because on the Preacher Boys website I have like a list of people who have been charged with sex crimes, and so I recognize Stephen Aaron Nguyen and Larry Allen Nguyen from Open Door. So I pulled up an article from Dallas News, and I'll put this in the show notes. So in February, Stephen Nguyen and his dad, Larry Nguyen, were both arrested for sexual assault on children.
Right.
And then in March.
And I have known them since I was probably 5 years old. We actually grew up together. So.
Wow. And this is just a year after what happened with the Sunday school teacher at Parkside.
They were arrested a month or 2 months before the Parkside Sunday school teacher.
That's wild.
So they were arrested in February. The pastor of that church, Open Door, Bob Ross, he was arrested in March, or was it April, because he did not report the sexual abuse in his church, and then.
Yeah, I recognize his name as well.
Parkside had it all literally came down to a head all at the same time in an area. And it's pretty embarrassing. So
how connected were these churches with each other? Were they very much islands on their own, but they just happened to have the same problems?
Well, I'll say this: the church at Parkside Baptist Church, they had a pastor for over 20 years who was a Hyles Anderson graduate, and he had left Parkside. He had, I guess, retired and went into evangelism for a short time. And when that really wasn't working out, he went to go pastor his own church in the Hill Country in Texas. And then the new pastor who took over, you're going to recognize this person's name, I'm sure. He was a graduate from Trinity Baptist Church in Florida, which is Bob Gray's college. Right. Bob Gray, Florida. We know what kind of situations that man had. And I didn't know anything about him until after I left and I started Googling. And I saw that even he had problems. So I'm like, well, they're all trained from sexual predators and they're all trained from the same people. And so it's basically the fruit of their training. So.
Right. Yeah, you start looking at if one place is producing 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, the count goes on. And this is just Texas. If you have 6 people in 1 or 2 cities in Texas that all came from similar background,
right.
And actually I think 4 or 5 all came from Hyles, then you have one from this other college. You do have to start looking and saying, is this something that's a fruit of what they came from, or are they all anomalies that happen to be planted right next to each other? For people who are listening who maybe aren't familiar with Hyles or Bob Gray or those kind of organizations, when you specify like, oh, they're all from Hyles, why do you feel that's important to note? Like, and I think I may have just answered it with what I just said, but why do you think it's so important that people recognize, like, hey, these guys all came from the same place?
Well, when I was really active in the church, I thought of Hyles Anderson as being the gold standard. I was going to public school and junior high and most of high school, and we had to do a report on one college that we wanted to go to whenever we graduated high school. And so I did, of all colleges, I did Hyles Anderson. So I called Hyles Anderson, I ordered a catalog, and I did my report on why Hyles Anderson was such a great college. And in my mind, it was the gold standard. And no churches could ever measure up to Hyles Anderson because they had really good high standards. They were King James only, right. And it made Bob Jones and Pensacola and West Coast all look like they were second class compared to Hyles Anderson.
Right.
So Hyles Anderson, they're known for having those stricter standards and stuff, and knowing but once you leave, you also know that they're known for having all the cover-ups.
So how, for some people, they may be hearing that and saying, that doesn't make sense. How could the strictest, the most, the quote unquote gold standard of, like, they go above and beyond to make sure that they maintain this out of this world righteousness, so to speak. Why do you feel that a school with that reputation is producing these kinds of people? What is it? Is it something that's in the teaching? Do you think it's an issue? I know I've talked with guests before. Do you think it's an issue of so repressed that it just explodes? Like, what do you think that cause is? Why do you think there's so many people coming out of this college that are pretty messed up?
Well, no, I'm not really sure because I never went to school there. But I mean, when you look at the sexual assaults that go on in this country, but you see that commonality between all of them, and most of them have training in one of these colleges. And Hyles, I've watched since I've left. When I was actively involved, I've never looked into this stuff. But once I left, I looked at videos about Jack Hyles and how and I realized that he had an affair with one of his deacon's wives, supposedly,
Right.
and he was known for his own affairs, but also we have his son Dave Hyles
Right.
that also had all his affairs, and it's just the fruit of that college, and they're just known for turning them out.
Huh. That's interesting. And I do recommend anybody listening, if you want a little bit more context regarding specifically David Hyles, but just Jack Hyles and the influence on the IFB. Sarah Smith from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram did a story in 2018 called "The Spirit of Fear." It's a little difficult to track down, but it's not awfully difficult. It has a lot of great information about sexual abuse within the IFB, and it opens with a very solid story recapping some of the life of David Hyles, who was Jack Hyles' son. And so if you guys haven't heard that, I'd recommend checking that out. So I'm curious now, and obviously you're, by doing this show, you're trying to be vocal about the issues you see. I think, like myself, you're trying to prevent people from being abused, but also open the eyes of people who are maybe involved with ministries that are complicit in abuse. What would you say to someone who's sitting in the pew of a church right now, an IFB ministry that, recognizes some of these problems, or maybe they're starting to recognize some of these issues, but they either feel that they're scared to leave because of, the ramifications that you talked about earlier, or they feel like, do I want to throw the baby out with the bathwater? Maybe it's not the organization. What would you say to someone who's kind of on the fence and starting to question where they're at? What would be your advice to them?
Run. Get out as fast as you can. I mean, I really don't see any good in this movement, and the best advice is to stick it out. And I've dealt with people from the former church who have totally cut me off. Totally,
Right.
when they see me, they're going down the other aisle in the store, or whatever. I mean, I still have these IFB. This I guess this little mentality of that. I still have. For example, when I have left the IFB, I had a very hard time because I was still judging people on the inside, not outwardly, but on the inside. I was judging people for, like, I started I went to Chuck Swindoll's church for a short time.
Oh, wow.
And,
Okay.
and when I went there, in my head, I felt like I was sinning because I wasn't going to IFB church. And so that kind of mindset still, I mean, it's gotten a whole lot better since then, but it is I had a fight with for a time. But I would just recommend anyone who's in the pews and they see problems that just to get out. Just don't give them their minute of your time. It's just not worth it. And
So you can go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
one thing about you had talked about previously, one thing that I realized after leaving the IFB church is that they they foster environments of sexual abuse. And one way that I really didn't think about until this case came to court and I saw what the court records all said. And you know, when there when you go out soul winning, your whole entire the church encourages grown men to take a boy with them when they go out soul winning because you have more
Right.
teams in the field. You can knock more doors. Well, when I was reading over some court documents and I was seeing that there were instances happening of abuse while soul winning, and I was thinking like I never thought about how this a man and a boy who's not the man's son going out soul winning was ever an issue. I thought it was normal. And now that I look back, I'm like, I was just like, that's just asking for a problem right there in itself.
Even
So,
if the intentions of everyone doing it isn't wrong, you're
right,
leaving yourself open. It's just not
definitely,
wise.
right.
Um,
And I had saw, but as an IB and being actually like I was, I never saw an issue with it
right.
until I had left. And
So what would you say? And I'm just curious because I have had, you know, and I'm asking this knowing where I stand on it. I think you know where I would be as well. But I've had many people that have reached out or commented on the show, and they struggle with the idea of, these churches are quote unquote independent. That's in their name. So something that happens in Mesquite, Texas, doesn't reflect my church in Hammond, Indiana, or my church in Louisiana or California. So, what would you say to someone who says, well, maybe that was your experience in your city and it was a bad situation, but why should I question the church I'm going to in, you know, California or in Colorado? What would be your response to them?
well, I guess I would say that they're all from the majority are from these same I call them sects, but you have the Heil sect, you have the Bob Jones sect, and you have this um commonality between all these colleges that they all come from. And I
Right,
would just say it won't be long before things are going to come to a head, and you have to and you're going to have to eventually um, deal with that once it
right,
happens. And I that's why I encourage everyone who's listening probably just get out of these churches because I mean it's just not worth the longer you stay, the more damage is being done,
right.
and it's just best to get out. And one thing I had told my pastor here this last Tuesday I had told him I said that one thing that I never realized is how much the independent Baptists idolize the King James Bible. They
Right.
idolize standard. They idolize all
The
these things
pastors.
about the
Yeah.
pastors and they idolize all these things and all these people. And one thing I realized after I left was when I was a teenager, that we had a, a I guess a before Sunday night service. It was called Young Fundamentalist, and you would think based on the name we were going to go to this class and we were going to learn about the fundamentals of the faith. But never did they ever teach the fundamentals of the faith. What they
Right.
taught you in that class was standards. Why you wear skirts and dresses, why you wear a suit, coat, and a tie, why you do this and don't do that, and those were things. And I would just tell these people like, if you really get down to it, if your pastor is preaching and he's idolizing his standards and you're idolizing a man or the King James Bible or whatever, that that's clearly a sign that that's the kind of church they are.
So, do you feel, and I think you may have already answered this, but do you feel that there something that could happen that could lead to reform of this movement, or do you think it's foundationally flawed?
I don't think there's any hope to reform it. I have one friend who still goes to the church I used to go to, but she's not really faithful to church every single week. And she'll tell me things like, "Oh well, Tim, we have a brand new pastor, and all things are well." And I was like, "Well, your brand new pastor is having men come in who are preaching the exact same things that we heard under your former pastor." I said, and these same men, they idolize Jack Hyles, and they idolize all these people, and and the only response I get is that, well, we have a new pastor and he's nothing like that. It's like, well, the thing is, your pastor is still having these men who have problems of their own come
Right.
in and to preach. And I said, I'll never go back. And so there's definitely, I don't see any kind of possibility that they could reform. I think it's just flawed to where there's no way to fix it. So
Awesome. So where are you going? You mentioned talking to your pastor last week. Where are you attending now? Are you going to a Southern Baptist church, or is it a Methodist church? What church are you going to now?
well, it's Wally Gospel Fellowship, and it is um it's an independent church, um and I guess they're Baptist. I mean, as far as the doctrine goes, they're Baptist, but um that's one thing that I had an issue with when I came out, is that they were voting for a church name because it's a brand new church plant. And when they were voting for a name, I wanted Baptist to be in the name. I was like, I want this to be in the name. And whenever I I was probably the only person who voted for Baptist to be in the name, and everyone else voted to take Baptist out of the name, to not have it in there at all. And I remember I'm probably holding a grudge in my heart for probably about a good 6 months. It was just like, thinking, how dare they have this church that's supposed to be Baptist and not going to have Baptist in the church name? And so yeah, that's the church I'm going to now.
Yeah, no, I mean that's all super interesting. And this one's crazy because, like, and if you're listening to this episode, I encourage you to do the same. Um, every case you mention is documented and is a Google search away to find these people. And the fact that you, in a small area of Texas, encountered 6 or 7 people that all were doing the same things is pretty startling. And then I know it's crazy for me. Like, I recognize Mike Wells. I'm trying to figure out where I recognize him from. I'm pretty sure that I'm pretty sure I've seen him in
Okay,
California.
Mike Wells, he's affiliated with the Sword of the Lord.
Okay.
They do advertise, I believe, his college in their papers. I got one in the mail actually about a month ago. I don't know why I got one in the mail, and I just threw it away. I didn't even look through it. But he is a social. He goes to all the sword conferences, and he has Shelton Smith come to his church every missions conference, I believe. Or no, he has a Baptist leadership conference that he has. He has Shelton Smith come. He has Ray Young from Hammond
Uh,
come down for, and so he has a lot of big names come down. He has John Hamlin comes down.
right.
Um, so we have they
No,
have lots of.
and it seems like a lot of these guys are connected to like Awake America and Capital Connection, which I unfortunately had a background with several years ago, doing some media work with them. Um, but yeah, it's I mean, guys, this if you're listening to this episode, this is one of the prime examples when I say they're not truly independent. This is, I mean, you can just start drawing lines between all of these and see all the root causes. You can see piles popping up. You can see shared colleges out of Texas coming up. You can see shared philosophies. Their doctrinal statements look like they're copied and pasted from each other. This is not a bunch of random churches that are independent. These are people that are sharing staff, they're sharing speakers, they're sharing ideology. And so I encourage everybody, like, don't just take our word for it. Start Googling. Like, it didn't take me long to pull up every single name that was mentioned and see a correlation, see similar time frames, and it's pretty startling. So,
One,
yeah,
one thing, one thing you had just mentioned is that that's another thing I saw is very similar between the IFB and the Mormons, that they're told to not Google. That Google is your biggest
right,
enemy, and
100%.
if you Google, then you're gonna find this anti stuff and this and so on and so forth. And we're told the exact same things in the IFB church. There's no difference. I mean, as far as that goes, there's just some very big similarities, and that's what makes me. I have a friend who he has a ministry to the cults here, pretty close to the Dallas area, and one thing I asked him, I said, why are the independent Baptists not in this book about the cults? I said, there definitely should be a chapter on independent Baptists in
Right,
this book. They're very cultic. And he said, well, he really didn't give me a good reason for why they weren't involved in that, or why they weren't like in that book. But hopefully one day he'll see it my way, and he'll add a whole new chapter to that book. But
right. Yeah, you could add a couple
there's so many.
chapters.
Yeah, you could. One for each sect. So
So, I know we're here coming up at the end of an hour, but I'm curious, are there any resources that you have found that have been good? I've referenced, the big book of bad Baptist preachers, and there's been a couple good articles, like Sarah Smith's article, um, uh, Praying from the Pulpit, uh, several decades ago was very solid. Is there anything you found that's been a good kind of all-encompassing look at the IFB, or do you feel like there has yet to be something very solid regarding it?
I have not really come across it yet. I'm still trying to find some books myself, so I haven't really come across anything yet. Um, the only thing that I've come across is obviously just the podcast that 3 years of someone else's podcast, and but other than that, there are some books that have been mentioned that I do want to try to read. But I guess here in the next couple of months I'll go ahead and get those in. So, but as far as like resources, I really don't have any. But I would encourage anyone who's still in it to Google some names, and maybe Google some names of the evangelists they have come into their church, or Google
Right. That's
their own
so
pastor.
smart.
Or even if you go on like I did, on the sex offender registry. I mean, there's going to be places on there you can check. That's free and that's public, and you can look at one up and just see who's listed. You'll be surprised as to. I mean, at Parkside we had 3 or 4 registered sex offenders who are actively going to that church, and I told myself that I wouldn't send my dog to that church now because there's no guarantee it's going to be safe. So,
Right.
I mean,
Well, I appreciate you kind of sounding the alarm and sharing your story. I know it's not easy to necessarily reflect on some of the craziness of the past, but I appreciate you, really sharing that perspective, being open, sharing some of the churches you attended and stuff. And I really hope people will do some work and research out on their own. And I think your call to action to research everybody that comes in your church, that's so smart, especially if you're a parent with kids. Do you really want to just trust that everybody there is doing this right? And that, honestly, that goes for any church or organization that you're in, even outside the IFB. It's always smart to just do a little bit of research.
that was one thing I did when I went to this new church plant. I went ahead and just Googled every single person in that church just to
Yeah.
make sure. And so everyone came back clean, so we're good.
So, all right. Well, Tim, thank you so much. Is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up here?
No, I think we said it all. Just encourage folks just to read and just to research and find out for themselves. So
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this episode, guys. Be sure if you like the episode to share it. Leave a comment. Let us know if you have any other questions. If you want, if you're having trouble finding any of the links that were mentioned, I'd love to get those over to you. And yeah, don't forget to rate and review on iTunes, get us bumped up a little bit, and get more people to hear this interview. So thank you so much, Tim, and we'll sign it off.
All right, thank you.